Hello, everybody. It's Roger Royce, corporate partner with Haynes Boone in downtown Palo Alto in Silicon Valley. And today I want to talk about getting angel and venture funding. I recently did a webinar, an hour and a half, on how to get angel and venture funding for your startup. And I want to give you some of the highlights here for the next 20 or 30 minutes or so. So why don't you settle in and let's talk. So the first thing I like to tell startups when they come to me and talk about going out into the market and raising money is that there are a few basic principles that the company really wants to have in mind going forward. And it's better that you just get the right mindset to start rather than learning this as you go along. So let's just start with basic principles, and then we'll get into some more of the specifics. So number one, and this is sometimes hard for companies to acknowledge, but you really have to think of investors as your partners, right? It's, you might get lucky and get some passive investors at the early pre-seed stages, but that's the wrong way to look at it because you're going to be living with these people, and they really are partners. It's like a marriage with no divorce, because once they're in your company, you're in it for the long haul. Unless you can agree to something otherwise. Second basic principle that sometimes people have a little trouble with is the concept of staging. And from time to time, somebody will walk into my office and they'll say, I don't want to spend the rest of my life fundraising. So I'm just going to raise $50 million right now and never have to worry about this again. And to that, I say two things. Number one, no, you're not. You don't. Not very many companies can just raise a lot of money right out of the gate without having gotten a little further down the road. But secondly, you wouldn't want to, right? You wouldn't even want to, even if you could, because your valuation increases over time. So what you want to do is you want to raise enough money to get to the next valuation metric. And I'm going to talk more about that later. But just keep in mind, you're not going out into the market, with a knockout punch. You're going out into the market with more jabs and hooks, just small amounts as your valuation increases. Thirdly, and I don't believe I have to say this, but sometimes I do, but most funding is dilutive, right? You're not going to own 100% of your company after you take on funding. And there's only 100% that can be divided up. And so it's really good to keep an eye on your cap table as you go along. This can get to be very tricky when you've got safes and convertibles because you have to do some math and some what ifs to know what you own on a fully diluted basis at any given time. Fourth one, and this is the most counterintuitive thing you're ever going to hear, is around valuation. It's not your biggest issue typically. And secondly, it's not as big a deal as you think. And thirdly, it might have nothing to do with what you're worth. And that's really hard to get your mind around. But valuation is just a math metric that determines what percent of the company the investor is going to get and how much money you need. And a lot of people get hung up on, well, I'm worth this, I'm worth that. My buddy over there at his startup, he's worth this, I must be worth that. That's really not the calculus. The calculus is more just math based on mostly those factors. Now, I can talk more about this. I can identify at least 30 different ways you can value companies. And you can go out and hire a professional valuation, and you can get a 409A valuation for option purposes. But companies are often surprised to find out that the valuation they get out in the investment market is much different than any of those. Different than their 409A, different than their estate valuation, different than their professional valuations. And I think it's because valuation is kind of a misnomer. It really is just a plugged math number typically. I suggest you avoid early mistakes. We have my whole podcast is devoted to that concept of avoiding early legal mistakes. Fix them before you talk to an investor. I tell my startup company clients that mistakes are typically free or at least cheap at this stage. We can fix them If an investor finds a mistake in your company, your cap table's messed up, your IP, you don't have ownership of it, you've got employee problems, misclassification, all of that stuff, you've got tax issues, they're going to ding you. They might walk away. They might say, come back to us after you've got your company cleaned up. And oh yeah, we might have invested in your competitor by then. So the way to avoid early mistakes is, number one, don't make them. Number two, if you do make them, let's find them and fix them before you go out to the market. Another basic principle is you should always be taking the cheapest money available, as a general rule. Now, with a million qualifications, but you should have a bias towards cheap money. What do I mean by cheap money? Well, non-dilutive financing is best. That's revenue. You don't give up anything. Grants are second best. You typically have to match those, so they're not with equity financing, so they're not typically 100% non-dilutive. Sometimes they are, depending on your industry and the granting organization. But debt is almost always going to be cheaper than equity, because you're just paying interest. You're not giving up a share of the future upside in your company. But frankly, if you qualify for debt, then you are not a candidate for venture capital or angel funding, because that means you've got cash flow and you're not reinvesting in massive explosive growth like venture-backed startups typically need to do. But if you can do that, then you shouldn't even be talking to equity investors. You should just be doing debt. It's a lot cheaper. And then some other more practical stuff that's a little more in the weeds. For example, when you go out to the market, you're always going to sell convertibles to raise money, or you're going to sell a preferred stock. You're never going to sell a common stock to raise money. You use your common stock to reward contributors, investors, etc. And this is kind of a basic, this is one of those always wear sunscreen pieces of advice. Just get a data room. Get a data room as soon as you can. Start storing signed documents in your data room. It'll make your life a lot easier down the road. And it'll make it a lot easier to do all that cleanup ahead of time. Now, where does a startup get money from? There are a handful of sources of funding that are worth talking about. So most startups will first get money from the founders. And this is a little bit of a tricky art, because your investors, they're going to want to see that the founders have some skin in the game. And I've seen this over and over where the founders have nothing in it and they got no incentive to stick around. They get distracted and they walk away. So they're going to want to see that the investors have money in the company. But they also, if they're sophisticated, don't want you to have so much money in your company that you're going to do something crazy, like lie to them. So I tell people, there is a number, and I tell people that you should have seeded this company yourself to get it going, just so people know you're serious and you've got skin in the game. Now, a lot of founders will finance their companies through their savings, through their IRAs, not their 401ks, but their IRAs, their credit cards. They might go mortgage their house. I advise people not to do that. Just don't do that, because if you're mortgaging house to fund a startup, that tells me you might not be able to afford it. This is like going to Las Vegas, except the odds are worse. You don't gamble any more than you can afford to lose. You really want to gamble with other people's money, right? OTM. We talked about debt financing. We talked about government grants. We'll do a whole hour on government grants at some point. But after the founders, the next money in is typically going to be friends, families, and fools. And this is, Thanksgiving dinner with your uncle, where you describe your idea and say, look, I got a pitch deck, but it's just an idea, don't have proof of concept, don't have a product yet. Would you throw a little money in? And these people will do that just to do you a favor, because they believe in you and they want to give you a start or whatever. It's small money. It's zero due diligence typically. And it'll go in as some form of convertible instrument, which we'll talk more about later, convertible notes or simple agreements for future equity. So after that initial friends and family money, which might be, maybe it's small money, $5,000 to $20,000 each, $25,000 each, something like that. You'll go out to the angels. and the seed investors. And think of an angel as really, we call them professional investors, but in my experience, they're usually part-time professional investors. They just do it a lot, okay? And they see lots of companies, and they do it enough that they know what a risky game this is, but what a huge reward is potentially out there. And they'll do really the first money in, where they're going to start to impose a little bit of discipline on the company. But angels and seed investors, still, diligence is minimal. You're early stage, and all you really need, so there's nothing really to diligence. And all you really need to show them is proof of concept to get that first money in. Now, here in Silicon Valley, the angels are spoiled. They've got lots of good opportunities. And a lot of them will say, you know, proof of concept is nice, but I'd like to see traction. What do they mean by traction? They mean they want to know that somebody will pay you for your product. All right. That's the typical kinds of traction. You definitely need that at Series A. You probably need it at Series Seed, but some angels will insist on seeing something a little bit more than your proof that you've got a product that works. Incubators will fund companies. I will warn you, you're going to give up a lot of stock if you get into an incubator, but most of that stock that you're giving up is for the service component of what they do, and accelerators for that matter. Pitch competitions, that will be an opportunity to meet lots of angels. Pitch Global here in San Jose does quite a lot of these, and they have a very high level group of investors, not just angels, but mostly VCs. And that brings me to institutional money. Venture capital or private equity, you're going to be well down the road before you get there. And at that point, you really do have to have traction. Now, let me just say a word about what I still call alternative financing, because it's still out there, even though the SEC has chased most of this out of the country, other than kind of the obvious. So there's rewards-based crowdfunding. I don't see many people doing that much anymore. I think the fad is kind of come and gone, but it is still out there, where you basically go out and ask people for money just because you got a cool idea, and maybe they throw some money at you. When we talk about crowdfunding or crowd financing more accurately, in my world, we're talking about selling securities. And under the Jobs Act in 2012, as you recall, we got this new law that allows you to go out to the market on a platform, and you can now raise up to $5 million. The transaction costs are relatively high, and you can only take small amounts from any individual investor. But if you have the kind of company but the good thing is you can go out to a wide group of people on one of the commercial platforms, right? And I'll hesitate naming them here, but there are 3 or 4 really big ones that are very credible, and then a bunch that you might not have heard about. So crowd financing, like I say, it's relatively high transaction costs, but the laws have changed now. It used to be only 1 million. Now you can raise 5 million through this, and 5 million is real money. For $5 million, it's worth it. And you can test the waters, meaning you can go out and see if people will actually invest in your company before you do a whole lot more. And also you can consolidate those investments into some sort of custodial arrangement or a special purpose vehicle. So you're dealing with one investor and not 1,000, or 100, we'll say at $2,000 each. So I used to discourage people from doing crowd financings. I now encourage them to look at it. And again, it's got to be the kind of company or product that people out in the broad consumer market can understand, because it's really hard to crowd finance some ultra technical minor component, to the semiconductor industry, unless you're an engineer. But it's relatively easy to go out and crowd finance the latest, greatest, coolest wristwatch, I guess, as an example. Everyone could understand what that is. So it's worth taking a look at. Another thing that kind of hit its peak, I think, in 2017, and like I say, the SEC chased these out of the country for the most part. I say for the most part because there are legitimate SEC authorized exchanges operating in the US for tokens, coins, initial coin offerings, STOs, etc. So that market is out there if you got something that is subject to being tokenized. And it's just not the market in the US that it used to be because of US securities laws. And that's a whole hour in itself. But just keep in mind that alternative might be there. And then finally, royalty financing, which we all love to talk a lot about, just don't do too much of. Especially in startup land. And the reason why is because it looks a lot like debt. So you're kind of in a different realm. But what royalty financing or SEALs, shared equity appreciation loans or shared income appreciation loans, is where the company basically just sells off an income stream, right? You give me $100 today, I give you 10% of my revenue for the next 10 years or something like that. The benefit of it is that your angel doesn't have to wait until exit to get paid. And that's something. Some angels, I've got companies I've invested in 20 years ago. I'm still waiting, right? So that could be longer even. So, your angel might say, look, I'd like to get a little more current return. And with royalty financing, they'll get their return fairly immediately. However, the downside is that it's capped, right? It's capped. There's only so much money they're going to make on this. Whereas with a traditional equity investment, it's much riskier, but the potential reward is much higher. And like I say, it is very much like debt. So if you're thinking of doing that kind of deal, it's kind of hard to find a company that has that kind of revenue and that kind of income and doing that. And by the way, the VCs will view that as debt when they come to invest. So that's not a good thing with them. So I just don't see those deals hardly at all. I mean, there are some funds that specialize in it and some companies it's appropriate for, but not that often. Okay, let's say we get to our financing, and I want to focus a little bit. First of all, how much, like I say, angels, maybe you get 25 grand each from them. Angel groups, you'll raise 250,000 to $1 million from your angel group. Early stage VC, 1.5 million on up to 5 million. Later stage VC, $10 million and up. Think of those numbers in terms of magnitude. And the rules are proven by the exceptions because I've done huge Series A rounds. So that does happen. So when you do go out to seek investment, typically there is a lead investor. I mean, it's to some extent you are investing with a group, but there's more than one. But for the most part, you're going to negotiate primarily with one lead. It'd be a real disaster if you had to have 6 different negotiations going on, and everybody else will follow the lead. They might have input, but they're going to tag along. So when you do go get your lead investor, they're picking you as a partner, but you should be picking them as a partner just as much. So what are we looking for? Number one, I say you look for smart money in your lead. You look for someone that knows your industry. The beauty of venture capital is not that it's just money. It's that you're getting their experience, you're getting their contacts, you're getting their connections, you're getting their capability to do the follow-on rounds that you're going to need, or find somebody who will. So look for the smart money. Find some chemistry, people you can get along with. You can go online and find plenty of examples of deals that didn't work out because the founders just could not get along with their investors. You definitely want people that are committed to the company. I've been in many deals where the investor gets in and they get cold feet long before the founders do and force an early exit. I've got lots of war stories about that. So make sure they're committed to stay with you for the long term, or at least as long as you are. Deep pockets, or otherwise dry powder, and what I mean by this is that it'd really be nice to have a lead that's going to be able to do the next round. And why that's nice is when you go out, when you do your Series B round, if the A investor is not participating in the B, well, that sends a message to the market. That's not a good one. So you'd like to know that whoever your lead investor is going to stick with you. And then finally, it's really important and good to find a lead, and all investors for that matter, if they've got a good network, that's great. If they can bring other people into the deal, that's the better way to do it. I want to jump ahead a little bit here and talk more about outside money. So let's go back to my staging comment. I'm going to go back to my basic principles. I guess I'm jumping back to my basic principles. So when we do go to outside money, this is after your founder money, really after your friends and family money. The question is going to be, how much do I raise? And this is going to be a formula. And at a high level, when you stage a financing, really you want enough money to get to the next valuation event, right? So if you think you're worth $5 million pre-money today, but once you get that, you get your product out into the market, you're worth 10, we'll get enough money to get your product into the market. I mean, that's kind of the simplest example. Now, let me put a little meat around that. Where I start is I say, we like enough money to take us 1 to 2 years out and double our value. So that's the first metric, right? And that's more aspirational, probably than practical, but that's what I'm kind of looking for as we plan this out. Because you do not want to do a down round, right? You don't want to raise too much money at too high valuation now, so the next round that you do is at a lower valuation. That is a very bad message to the market. That means something is really wrong. So, double evaluation 1 to 2 years out, next valuation point. And to put a little bit more detail into that, that means you're going to have to think about milestones. You're going to have to think about milestones are just those metrics, the thing you're trying to get to, the FDA approval, the product in the market, the tape out, whatever it is. Secondly, a term you'll have to become familiar with is burn rate. And that means exactly what it sounds like. It's how fast are you spending the money? And the investors are going to push you really hard always to reduce the burn, right? Reduce the burn rate. What's your target runway? How much time do you need? It's just math, function of your burn rate. And then finally, as we talked to before, the valuation comes into this. And keep in mind, that's just a math. How much money is your investor going to want, and how much money are you going to need to get to that next valuation metric? How much equity is that investor going to require to invest in you? And poof, that's going to be your valuation. And by the way, you will be super surprised. This all sounds very fuzzy, and more art than science, but you'll be surprised how close different investors will come in on valuation when you go out and talk to VCs. It's almost like a black art. Like, how do they know? How are they so close? Okay, money to not take. That's as important as money to take. Sounds odd, but very true. And it's really important to know your investors. Do they have the same goals as you? Right? I've seen companies where the founder thinks they're just going to be a lifestyle business for the next 20 years. That many investors are going to live with that. You might want to have a talk with them about what the goals are, and what is the metric? What is the next milestone? When do we take new money? When do we exit? Is kind of the big question. Or do you even exit? Are you going to sell? Or does your investor think you're going to go public? Do you think you're going to go public? All right, cooperation and accessibility. This is bigger than it sounds, but you need investors who will cooperate, meaning they will sign documents when you need them to, because you're going to be doing follow-on investments. You're going to need, if they take a board seat, you're going to need to be able to get a hold of them and get them to attend board meetings or sign consents. And strategic investors are kind of notorious for disappearing on you, and you do not want to be ghosted by a board member. Could really make things difficult for your company. Be careful about control. You will not give up control in a Series A round, typically. You will give up control in a Series B round, typically. And that has real significance. So if you're handing the keys over to somebody, you probably want to know who they are and how long it's going to be before they fire you as the founder, as CEO, because that will happen eventually. And then take a hard look at terms and valuation when you get that term sheet from the investor. And like I said before, valuation is not your biggest issue typically, because what they give you in terms of valuation, they might take away in other terms. And different venture capitalists have different kind of approaches on this. The bigger ones I found, the bigger, more well-known ones, tend to give you less value but better terms than the smaller ones, which will give you higher valuation, but they might want something in the terms that you can't live with. So that's the kind of thing you need to really review carefully, because even though the market is super efficient and terms are getting more and more standardized, there are ways you could get tricked. So let me talk about angels for a minute, because that's really where you're going to go first for your first outside money. And what I say about angels is that really there's the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the good angels, the ones you want, are the ones that have connections to VC funding. They have connections to other angels. They're going to be able to get you additional money and get you that next institutional money. That's awesome. Find those guys. The other type of good angel are the ones that can put money in and be really good mentors. They can provide you with mentorship. That's great also. You want good mentors. And the other thing about a good angel is they understand that this is risk capital. They totally get that this whole thing could fail. They understand that. And they're going to go into that with that attitude. So you're not going to have to lie awake at night worrying what they're going to do if things don't go well. Those are good angels. Bad angels, I put those in 3 categories: hostage takers, whiners, and demanders. And the hostage takers are the ones that are going to use this clause. They'll say, hey, you chose to take outside money. Therefore, you have to do this for me, and you have to do that for me. And that's very much like a demander, right? They're going to be making demands. And the reason will be you chose to take outside money. You owe me fiduciary duties. Be careful about that. Some people can be like that. I've seen deals where the angel gets involved and says, okay, we're going to have weekly board meetings from now on. Well, that's a lot, right? And you have to, because you owe me duties. So I'm taking you hostage. And then, of course, there's the whiners that are always complaining. And I've seen them as well. And they will get in and micromanage your business and complain about every decision. And if it doesn't go well, they'll complain even more. Like, why don't you know this business better? Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? As well as demanding, where are my financials? Where are my reports? So just be careful about those people. And then finally, there are what I call the ugly. And these people you stay away from. Number one, potential plaintiffs, right? And it sounds odd for a lawyer to say this, but you do not want litigious investors. When you sell securities, you've heard of caveat emptor. With the sale of securities, which is what you're doing when you take investors, is really seller beware, right? Because you are very much exposed if you made a mistake. And there are professional plaintiffs out there, trust me. And the good news is that it's really easy to find out who. You just go search the public record and see how many lawsuits these people have been involved in. Or you can just ask around. And there are investors. In fact, there's one fund that claims to be a VC fund, even though there's only one investor I know of, but that is his whole thing, is that he just sues everybody he invests in. And as you can imagine, he's not doing many investments these days. The other ways, you can do background checks. And I do a background check on everyone I do business with. And you should also. Trust me, the investors are doing a background check on you. You should check them out as well. It's in the information age, nobody can hide. It's easy to do. And then finally, just the disturbers. There are some angel investors who you kind of wonder why they're in your company, because all they are doing is just creating problems. They're riling up other investors. They're discouraging future investors. Believe it or not, I've seen it happen because they don't like the valuation you're trying to get or whatever. So stay away from them. So how do we know? How do you know if you got a good angel or a bad angel? Like I say, you can check these people out. The best way is to ask for references, just like they're asking for references from you, and talk to other companies they've invested in. How is this person to do business with? You'll save yourself a lot of trouble, and there will be money you won't take because of that. The other way is by looking at the terms they give you. If the terms are outrageously one-sided, especially these days when the market is so efficient, you've got someone who's trying to take advantage of you, and it's just going to get worse. All right, what kind of money would you take? And we're going to wrap up fairly soon, but I just want to mention a couple things about the securities aspect of this. So your first money in is almost always going to be a safe or convertible note. Now, I'm going to do a whole episode on safes. I don't want to belabor that here, but there was a time, and this is still true once you get outside of the East or West Coast, where the first money came in as a convertible note. That means a loan that has the right to convert into stock in the first outside financing. So think about it. We don't want to value the company now, but we need the money now. It's too early to put a value on. The company would be worried about valuing it too little. The investor would be worried about valuing it too high. So how about you loan us the money and we'll just convert that money into stock at a discount to the first outside valuation that we get from a professional investor, i.e. a venture capitalist. And that's a heck of a deal for everybody. And that's why it's done that way. The problem with convertible notes, it's really three things. Number one, they have to bear interest. Okay. It's not, it could be a zero interest rate, but then the tax law is going to impute an interest rate. So they typically bear interest, which has to be paid at close if it doesn't convert. And that's a taxable event for the investor, by the way, at ordinary income tax rates. Secondly, it's not a note unless it has a term on it. It's not debt unless it has a term. It has to be repaid at some point, meaning that you could get to that point and nothing happens, and now the note's due, and now you got a big debt, and that could tank the company. And yes, I have seen that happen. I've seen investors take the company because they have convertible notes. And thirdly, the note, because of the banking laws, they're typically very short term. And so that doesn't give you a lot of runway to get to that next event. So because of that, and because as a practical matter, the convertible note investors were not looking for a debt return anyhow. They weren't looking to make interest. That's not why they're investing. They're taking huge risk. They're looking for equity return. So they don't really care about all that stuff that makes it debt. And that's why safes became popular. And those are simple agreements for future equity. Now, the SEC, being the SEC as it exists today, has cautioned companies against safes and has cautioned investors against safes, has cautioned everybody against them on the grounds that they're not very safe. And in fact, I would say they're not simple, they're not equity, and they're not safe. So, but let me tell you some of the common features of notes and safes. They all have that common feature that they're going to convert to preferred stock. The difference is a safe, it's not debt, probably not debt. It kind of depends a little bit on the terms and the drafting, but typically we don't treat them as debt. So it doesn't pay interest, doesn't have a fixed repayment date. It just sits out there until something happens. And that something is either the next financing or a sale of the company or a liquidation, a dissolution. The conversion is going to be, and it's going to convert into preferred stock issued in the first equity financing after the safe or the note, typically. The conversion feature, there's automatic, optional, and then this prepayment right. So these things are almost never prepayable, right? The investors, they don't want just their money back. They don't want to give the company the right to just give them the money back. So you're not allowed to prepay, unlike other types of notes. And they'll convert automatically when you do a financing of a certain amount, or optionally at the option of the safe holder, if the financing amount is a little less than that, or the expiration of some term. These things always have valuation caps these days. An valuation cap is simply a maximum valuation at which a note will convert. And why do we do that? Because we don't want runaway valuations. We don't want somebody, the investor doesn't want to be putting money into a company that's worth $10 million today, only get equity later based on a $50 million valuation. So we'll put a cap and say, no matter what happens, the investor says, no matter what happens, I get at least this percent of the company when you do your equity financing. I get today's value for it. And that is very common. Don't make the mistake of thinking your valuation cap has anything to do with your valuation, even though everybody thinks of it that way. It really is more again, to prevent runaway valuations. Discount, it's almost always 20% these days. In other words, you angel put in $100,000, you're going to get your stock at a 20% discount to the price that the venture capitalist paid, because you got in early, you saw the future, you took the big risk, and that's your reward. On change of ownership, we have to figure out what happens. And the investors, they either will convert to common stock at a certain valuation, because there's no third-party valuation to value the company when a company just gets sold, right? So they either convert to common or they get a multiple on the sale. And a couple of other things you should note, these instruments will convert typically to a shadow preferred, not to preferred. Why is that? Well, because you're buying at a different price, right? You're getting your 20% discount, so your liquidation preference should be different from the person who's not getting the discount. Sort of a detail that we take care of in the documents. There's sometimes, if you have a smart investor with a side letter, what they call a most favored nations clause, which says, that's great, I'll sign whatever you want, but I get at least as good a terms as you give to anybody after me. And if you give another safe later with, let's say, a different valuation cap, I get the benefit of those terms. You'll see that. And then finally, the biggest thing about this is pre and post money. And I don't want to talk too much about that now. I'm going to do a whole podcast on this. But at a high level, as a general rule, if you're the company, you want to have a pre-money safe. If you're the investor, you want a post-money safe. And be careful, because what you download on the internet are typically going to be post-money safes. So with that, I think I am going to go ahead and call it. We'll come back with the next episode. We're going to talk a lot about safes. And then after that, we'll go talk about preferred stock and some of the preferred stock terms. So again, this is Roger Royse. I'm a partner with Haynes Boone in Palo Alto, heart of Silicon Valley, emerging growth and venture capital. And we'll see you next time.